So I'm starting to take too much time, so we want to jump right into a panel discussion led by Matt Cropp to give us some historical context on neighborhood planning assemblies.
So, my name is Matt Cropp. I've been working for the past 2 years on a project with the help of a small grant from the Chittenden County Historical Society, looking at the origins and development of the neighborhood planning assemblies. So I figured in this section of the meeting, I'd start by providing a little overview of the stuff that I've kind of found. I'm still doing interviews, still doing research, and if anyone has insights, I'd love to talk to you afterwards. And then Sandy Baird will sort of chime in with some perspective on the developments. Start by talking a little bit about the kind of context that the NPAs came out of. Before they were founded early in the Bernie Sanders administration in the 1980s. In the decade before, in the 1970s, the Paquette administration, Gordy Paquette was the mayor for 10 years. And there is a sense from the research that I've looked into that a lot of the needs of neighborhoods were being kind of subordinated to the needs of development, particularly with urban renewal that sort of destroyed a neighborhood in the center of downtown. A lot of people felt like they really weren't being heard, and so in the late 1970s, a number of independent community organizations based around neighborhoods emerged in Lakeside, in the South End, in the Old North End. Sort of by the early 1980s, there were 7 kind of major ones that were involved, and they were organized around often specific development issues. The Southern Connector was one of them. Waterfront development was a really big one, and the sitting mayor was seen as really out of touch by a lot of these groups. They hosted an event, a debate that at which Mayor Paquette really didn't come off looking terribly good. He made a statement kind of around how this is the first he'd heard of a lot of these groups existing. So a lot of observers, when Bernie Sanders won by a narrow plurality of about 10 votes, really sort of saw the kind of protest votes from these neighborhood groups as a really important factor. Shortly after his election, actually I have a picture of a poster I found today. A meeting of these neighborhood groups was called, and in May of 1981, that meeting happened, and a number of recommendations came out of that, including recommendations for the formation of these sorts of assemblies. And then the assemblies came through in '82, and Burlington had been designated a community block grant eligible city. So in the first year, each assembly was assigned $15,000 to distribute as the members decided they would like to, and that role was an important one, along with having serious input into the question of waterfront development. The most sort of active years in terms of participation was when the waterfront planning committee was really afoot. So here's a picture from the early 90s of Terry Bericious leading, I think, a Ward 2, Ward 3 NPA. Here's one. There's actually a great binder in the CEDO office with lots of pictures of all these little things around the city that were funded by this community block grant money, voted on directly by the neighborhood planning assemblies. And so, Sandy, do you want to throw in some thoughts?
Sure. My name is Sandy Baird. I've lived in Ward 1 for a very long time, actually since 1977, and I live on Luna Street. And I was here when the Sanders Revolution occurred, and it was indeed a revolution. He was elected, as Matt said, by 10 votes, and he was elected as an avowed socialist, which was very surprising in a city like Burlington, which had been led for many years by a very decent and respectable liberal, Gordon Paquette. And Gordon Paquette had done many things for the poor of his city, but most people believe that he'd gotten rather tired by 1981, and people were looking for a fresh voice and a fresh approach to the city. It was also felt, I think, that Mayor Paquette had become really sort of ingrown, and that the people that were involved in City Hall were people that were closely associated with him, but were not closely connected to any of the neighborhoods. So Bernie Sanders ran for mayor in 1981, And I don't know how many of you people remember Bernie, but I do. And he was kind of at that point a little bit of a hippie, I would say. He had run for office as governor of the state many, many times. By the way, I saw his recent speech that he gave in New Hampshire where he sort of announced that he might run for the president of the United States. And in that, he really talks about his history here in Burlington. I think it would be very great for all of us to look at it because it was such a shock that he won. Anyway, he was seen, obviously, as a fresh voice. He had been associated with a political party called the Liberty Union, which was, he ran around the state in a very old, junky car and ran for governor 3 or 4 times, then ran for congressman on Liberty Union, and finally decided that he couldn't win if he kept running on these third parties. And so he ran, however, in Burlington that year, he did run as an independent. And he ran against 2 or 3 liberal Democrats. The mayor's race was not at that time a partisan race. And so he ran and won by 10 votes. And it was a complete upset. And he did that by organizing, as he says, and as I remember, organizing people who were not involved in City Hall at that time. He particularly centered on the poor, the low-income neighborhoods, in particular senior citizens, working class people, people who had not been, they felt, represented in City Hall for a very long time. And he put together this coalition of people who were, as I said, not particularly, who had not even voted before. And he got them out to vote in huge numbers, too. He increased the voting that year, people who voted quite a bit, and he won in a very narrow victory of 10 votes. I remember that I was a state's attorney at that time. I worked in the prosecutor's office, and I had been involved tangentially, and I'm kind of a supporter of Paquette, as a matter of fact, and a Democrat, so I wasn't paying close attention to that race, but when I was in the state's attorney's office, his campaign organizer came in. He was a public defender. His name was John Franco, and he walked into the room and he said, "Good morning, comrade. You missed the revolution." And that was the way it was. It was perceived really as a revolution. And he went to do some revolutionary things, like the NPAs. But I want to say about the NPAs that I'm not so certain that the impetus from the NPAs came from the Sanders administration. It was, as you said, Matt, a grassroots movement to have neighborhoods that had some kind of input into City Hall. And that movement did exist before Bernie. He was smart enough, though, as a politician, to say, all right, they can have their NPAs. And the NPAs then were established. One of the key memories that I have, and I got involved in local politics and actually ran for mayor in 1989 as a Green, and the key issue that went to every NPA at that time was waterfront development, as Matt said. And surprisingly enough, the first big waterfront development that I remember hitting the news was under Bernie Sanders. I don't think he'd like me to remind him of this, but right early in the, remember Bernie Sanders ran on the slogan, I don't know how many people here remember this, the waterfront is not for sale. Anybody remember that but me? No. Big posters all over town, the waterfront is not. And then he got into office and he proposed to sell the waterfront to a corporation called the Alden Corporation, which was going to put in a high-rise hotel on the waterfront and also high-priced condominiums. Neighborhood assemblies got really active over that issue. And that's what I first remember getting very involved. And people would go from NPA to NPA, showing this new development that was going to take up their waterfront. And it was really an outrageous issue. It was the first defeat, actually, that he suffered. And I must say he suffered it graciously. Because there was a bond that was proposed to do this development, and that was refused by the citizens, largely sparked by the NPAs. When it happened, however, his administration went into high gear, actually, to make sure that the waterfront remained belonging to the people. And it was at that point that there was a lawsuit that was commissioned by his administration and went to the Vermont Vermont Supreme Court, determining what has become known as the public trust doctrine. And that public trust doctrine said, in effect, that the waterfront, particularly that area of the waterfront that was landfill, that the railroad had filled in, was really the lake, and that the waterfront and the lake belonged to the people of the state of Vermont. It could not be sold, period, end of statement, really. And I've always appreciated that Ernie really did change his mind, and that the waterfront development that took place after that, under Sanders, under Clavel, under Bob Kiss, and currently with our Mayor Merle Weinberger, has perceived that the waterfront truly does belong to us in Burlington, and in fact, to the citizens of the state of Vermont. And so that's my story about the NPAs. I sometimes go to my own NPA. I work on Wednesday nights. I miss it. I never can get there. I think it's a very valuable tool of democracy. I think that it's a very important institution, and I really commend our city for remembering that citizenship for residents, power to residents, really power belongs to the people of the city and the neighborhoods, and that they were founded on that idea that all citizens and residents of our community should have a say in what happens in our city. Anyway, so that's my story of the NPAs.
Thank you, Sandy.